Morning, on page 618, chapter 2, or corruption, question mark. But I have been brought up short. You are not talking about the subject at all. You have got off track again, onto prison. And what you are supposed to be talking about is camp. But I was also, I thought, talking about camp. Well, all right, I'll shut up. I shall give some space to contrary opinions. Many camp inmates will object to what I have said, and will say that they did not observe any ascent of the soul, that this is nonsense, and that corruption took place at every step. More insistent and more significant than others, because he had already written about this, was Shalamov's objection. Quote, in the camp situation, human beings never remain human beings. The camps were created to this end. Unquote. All human emotions, love, friendship, envy, love of one's fellows, mercy, thirst for fame, honesty, fell away from us, along with the meat of our muscles. We had no pride, no vanity, and even jealousy and passion seemed to be Martian concepts. The only thing left was anger, the most enduring of human emotions. We came to understand that truth and falsehood were kin sisters. Friendship is born neither of need nor of misfortune. If friendship does arise between human beings, it means the conditions are not that difficult. If misfortune and need have joined hands, it means they were not in extremis. Grief is insufficiently sharp and deep if it can be shared with friends. So true. There's only one distinction here to which Shalamov agrees. Ascent, growth in profundity, the development of human beings is possible in prison, but, quote, camp is wholly and consistently a negative school of life. There is nothing either necessary or useful that anyone derives from it. The prisoner learns flattery, falsehood, and petty and large-scale meanness. When he returns home, he sees not only that he has grown during his time in camp, but that his interests have become meager and crude, unquote. Y. Ginsberg also agrees with this distinction, while prison ennobled people, while camp corrupted them, unquote. And how can one object to that? In prison, both in solitary confinement and outside solitary too, a human being confronts his grief face to face. This grief is a mountain, but he has to find space inside himself for it, so to familiarize himself with it, to digest it, and it him. This is the highest form of moral effort, which has always ennobled every human being. A duel with years and within walls constitutes moral work and a path upward, if you can climb it. If you share those years with a comrade, it is never in a situation in which you are called on to die in order to save his life, nor is it necessary for him to die in order for you to survive. You have the possibility of entering not into conflict, but into mutual support and enrichment. But in camp, it would appear you do not have that path. Bread is not issued in equal pieces, but thrown onto a pile. Go grab. Knock down your neighbors and tear it out of their hands. The quantity of bread issued is such that 1 or 2 people have to die for each who survives. The bread is hung high up on a pine tree. Go fell it. The bread is deposited in a coal mine. Go down and mine it. Can you think about your own grief, about the past and the future, about humanity and God? Your mind is absorbed in vain calculations for which for the present moment cut you off from the heaven, and tomorrow are worth nothing. You hate labor. It is your principal enemy. You hate your companions, rivals in life and death. You are reduced to a frazzle by intense envy and alarm lest somewhere behind your back, others are right now dividing up that bread which could be yours. That somewhere on the other side of the wall, a tiny potato is being ladled out of the pot which could have ended up in your own bowl. Camp life was organized in such a way that envy pecked at your soul from all sides, even the best defended soul. Envy also extended to terms and to release itself. In 1945, we, the 58s, had to see the non-political offenders off at the gates as a result of Stalin's amnesty. What were our feelings toward them? Gladness for them because they were going home? No. It was envy because it was unjust to free them and to hold us. And V. Vlasov, who got a 20-year term, served out his first 10 years calmly, for who was not serving out 10 years? But in 1947-48, when they began to release many others, he envied them, got nervous, and was eating his heart out. How was it that he had received a sentence of 20? How galling it was to have to serve a second tenor. Now I did not ask him, but I suppose that when these others began to return to camp as repeaters, then he must have calmed down. And in 1955-56, the 58s were being released on a mass scale, and the non-political offenders were left in the camps. What did they feel at that point? A sense of justice because the long-suffering article, after 40 years of incessant persecutions, had at long last been pardoned? No, in fact, there was universal envy. I received many letters of this sort in 1963. They had freed, quote, the enemies who were far worse than us habitual criminals, unquote. And why then are we still here? For what? And in addition, you are constantly gripped by fear of slipping off into that pitifully low level to which you are clinging, of losing your work, which is still not the hardest, of coming a copper on a prisoner transport, of ending up in a strict regiment camp. And on top of that, you got beaten and you were weaker than all the rest, or else you yourself beat up those weaker than you. And wasn't this corruption? Soul mange is what A. Rubailo, an old camp veteran, called this swift decay under external pressure. Amid these victories, intense, petty calculations, when and on what foundation could you ascend? Chekhov, even before our corrective labor camps, I thought he was making a joke for me. Even before our corrective labor camp, observed and identified the soul corruption on Sakhalin. He wrote correctly that the vices of prisoners arose from their lack of freedom, enslavement, terror, and constant hunger, and their vices were dishonesty, slyness, cowardice, faint-heartedness, dual pigeoning, thievery. Experience had demonstrated to the hard labor convict that in the struggle for existence, deceit was the most reliable means. And wasn't all this multiplied tenfold among us? So, isn't it the right time not to object and not to rise to the defense of some sort of alleged camp ascent, but to describe hundreds, thousands of cases of genuine soul corruption? to cite examples of how no one could resist the camp philosophy of Yashka and Kazgan, worker center. The more you spit on people, the more they'll esteem you. To tell how newly arrived frontline soldiers in Krasnodar in 1942 had no sooner scented the thieves' atmosphere than they themselves undertook to play the thief, to plunder the Lithuanians, and to fatten up on their foodstuffs and possessions, you greenhorns can go die. Or how certain Vlasov men began to pass for thieves out of the conviction that that was the only way to survive in camp. Or about that assistant professor of literature who became a thief ringleader. Or to be astounded by the example of Chupenyov at how infectious that camp ideology was. Chupenyov stood it for 7 years on general work at timbering and became a famous lumberjack, but landed in hospital with a broken leg and was subsequently offered a position as a work assigner. He had no need for this job. He could certainly have dragged out as a lumberjack the 2.5 years he still had to serve, since the management made a great fuss over him. But how could he turn down the temptation? After all, it is a rule of camp philosophy, if they give it, take it, and Chupenyov became a work assigner for just 6 months, which were the most restless, troubled, and dismal of his whole term. And is now long since his term have been served out, and he will tell you with an open-hearted smile about those tall pines, but there is a stone in his heart because of those who died as a result of his slave driving. A Latvian, 6.5 feet tall, a captain who had sailed the 7 seas. Yes, and was he the only one? Conscious instigation of one prisoner against another can lead to just such awful soul mange. In Unschlag in 1950, Moise Bayeta, who, even though she was touched in the head, was still being marched to and from work under convoy, paid no attention to the convoy and went off to look for her mother. She was seized, tied to a post at the gatehouse, and it was announced that because of her escape attempt, the whole camp would be deprived of the next Sunday, a standard trick, and therefore, as the brigades returned from work, they spat at the trussed-up woman, and some even struck her. Because of you, bitch, we don't have a rest day. Moise Bayeta only smiled benignly. Moise Bayeta. And how much corruption was introduced by that democratic and progressive system of trustee watchmen, which in our Zec terminology became converted to self-guarding, introduced back in 1918. After all, this was one of the main streams of camp corruption, the enlistment of prisoners in the trustee guards. You had fallen. You were punished. You had been uprooted from life, but you wanted to avoid the very bottom of the pile. You want to hover over someone else, rifle in hand. And your brother? Here. Over your brother. Here, take it. And if he runs, shoot him. We will even call you comrade, and we will give you a Red Army man's ration. And he grows proud, and he tightens up his grip on the gun stock, and he shoots. And he is even more severe than the free guards. How is one to understand this? Was it really a pure-blind faith in social initiative? Or is it just an icy, contemptuous calculation based on the lowest human feeling? After all, it was not just a matter of self-guarding, either. There was also self-supervision and self-oppression, right up to the situation in the 30s when all of them, all the way up to the camp chief, were Zecs, including the transport chief, the production chief. And how could it have been otherwise anyway, when there were only 37 Chekists to 1,000 Czechs on the White Sea-Baltic Canal? Yes, and even security chiefs were Czechs too. One could not have carried out self-supervision any further than that. The Czechs were conducting. One could not have carried self-supervision any further than that. The Czechs were conducting interrogations on themselves. They were recruiting stool pigeons to denounce themselves. Yes, but I'm not going to examine those countless cases of corruption here. They are well known to everyone. They have already been described, and they will be described again. It is quite enough to admit that they took place. This is a general trend. This is as it should be. Why repeat about each and every house that in sub-zero weather it loses its warmth? It is much more surprising to note that there are houses which retain their warmth even in sub-zero weather. Shalamov says, everyone imprisoned in camp was spiritually impoverished, but whenever I recall encounter a former Czech, I find a real personality. Elsewhere, Shalamov himself writes that he wouldn't betray other Czechs, he wouldn't become a brigadier and compel others to work. Why is that, Varlam Tikhonovich? Why is it that out of the clear sky it appears to you that you would refuse to become either a stoolie or a brigadier, if it is the case that no one in camp can avoid or sidestep that slippery slope of corruption? Given the fact and truth that truth and falsehood are kin sisters, does it mean that you did nonetheless grasp at some branch sticking out? Does it mean that you found a footing on some stone and did not slide down any further? And maybe, despite everything, anger is not really the most long-lived feeling there is? Do you not refute your own concept with your character in verses? And how is it that genuine religious believers in camp survived in camp, as we mentioned more than once? In the course of this book, we have always mentioned that their self-confident procession through the archipelago, a sort of silent religious procession with invisible candles, and some among them were mowed down by machine guns, and those next in line continued their march, a steadfastness unheard of in the 20th century. And it was not in the least for show, and there weren't any declamations. Take some Aunt Ducia Chmil, a round-faced, calm and quiet, illiterate old woman. The convoy guards called out to her, "Chmil, what is your article?" She said gently, good-naturedly. She replied, "Why are you asking, my boy? It's all written down there. I can't remember them all." She had a bouquet of sections under Article 58. Your term. Auntie Ducia sighed. She wasn't given such contradictory answers in order to annoy the convoy. In her own simple-hearted way, she pondered this question. Her term? Did they really think it was given to human beings to know their term? What term? Till God forgives my sins. Till then, I'll be serving time. You are silly, silly, the convoy guards laughed. 15 years you've got, and you'll serve them all, and maybe some more besides. But after 2.5 years of her term had passed, even though she had sent no petitions, all of a sudden a piece of paper came. Release. How could one not envy those people? Were circumstances more favorable for them? By no means. It is a well-known fact that the nuns were kept only with the prostitutes and thieves in penalty camps, and yet who was there among the religious believers whose soul was corrupted? They died, most certainly, but they were not corrupted. And how can one explain that certain unstable people found faith right there in camp, that they were strengthened by it, and that they survived uncorrupted, and many more scattered about and unnoticed came to their allotted turning point and made no mistake in their choice. Those who managed to see that things were not only bad for them, but even worse, even harder for their neighbors. And all those who, under the threat of penalty zone and a new term of imprisonment, refused to become stoolies. How, in general, can one explain Grigory Ivanovich Grigoriev, a soil scientist, who volunteered for the People's Volunteer Corps in 1941, and the rest of the story is a familiar one. Taken prisoner near Vyazma, he spent his whole captivity in a German camp. The subsequent story is also familiar. When he returned, he was arrested by us, given a tenor. I came to know him in winter, engaged in general work in Ekbatsuts. His forthrightness gleamed from his big, quiet eyes, some sort of unwavering forthrightness. This man was never able to bow in spirit, and he didn't bow in camp either, even though he worked only 2 of his 10 years in his own field of specialization, and didn't receive food parcels from home nearly the whole term. He was subjected on all sides to the camp philosophy, to the camp corruption of soul, but he was incapable of adopting it. In the Kamarova camp, Antubeth, the security chief kept trying to recruit him as a stoolie. Grigoriev replied to him quite honestly and candidly, "I find it quite repulsive to talk to you. You will find many willing without me. Bastard, you will crawl on all fours. I would be better off hanging myself on the first branch." And so he was sent off to penalty situation. He stood it for half a year, and he made mistakes which were even more unforgivable. And when he was sent on an agricultural work party, he refused, as a soil scientist, to accept the post the brigadier offered him. He hooted and sighed with enthusiasm. Oh, sighed with enthusiasm. He hoed and sighed. Wow. He hoed and sighed with enthusiasm. I don't know why those words look so weird. And even more stupidly, in Ekbatsuts, at the stone quarry, he refused to be a work checker, only because he would have had to pad the worksheets for the sloggers, for which later on, when they caught up with it, the eternally drunk free foreman would have to pay the penalty. But would he? And so he went to break rocks. His honesty was so monstrously unnatural that when he went out to process potatoes with the vegetable storeroom brigade, he did not steal any, though everyone else did. When he was in good post in the privileged repair shop brigade at the pumping station equipment, he left simply because he refused to wash the socks of the free bachelor construction supervisor, Trevish. His fellow brigade members tried to persuade him. Come on, isn't it all the same, the kind of work you do? But no, it turned out it was not all the same to him. How many times did he select the worst and hardest lot, just so as not to have to offend against conscience? And he didn't, not in the least, and I am a witness. And even more, because of the astounding influence of his body, on his body, of his bright and spotless human spirit. Though no one today believes in any such influence, no one understands it. The organism of Grigory Ivanovich, which was no longer young, close to 50, grew stronger in camp. His earlier rheumatism of the joints disappeared completely, and he became particularly healthy after the typhus from which he recovered. In winter he went out in cotton sacks, making holes in them for his head and his arms, and he did not catch cold. So wouldn't it be more correct to say that no camp can corrupt those who have a stable nucleus? who do not accept that pitiful ideology which holds that human beings are created for happiness, an ideology which is done in by the first blow of the work designer's cudgel. Those people became corrupted in camp, who before camp had not been enriched by any morality at all, or by any spiritual upbringing. This is not at all a theoretical matter, since during our glorious half-century millions of them grew up. Those people became corrupted in camp who had already been corrupted out in freedom and who were ready for it, because people corrupted in freedom too, sometimes even more effectively than in camp. The convoy officer who ordered that Moiseyevet be tied to a post in order to be mocked. He had not been corrupted more profoundly than the camp inmates who spat on her. And for that matter, did every one of the brigade members spit on her? Perhaps only 2 from each brigade did. In fact, that is probably what happened. Tatiana Falik writes, "Observation of people convinced me that no man could become a scoundrel in camp if he had not been one before. If a person went swiftly bad in camp, what it might mean was that he had not just gone bad, but that inner foulness, which had not previously been needed, had disclosed itself." M.A. Voichenko has his opinion. In camp, existence did not determine consciousness, but just the opposite. Consciousness and steadfast faith in the human essence decided whether you became an animal or remained a human being. A drastic, sweeping declaration, but he was not the only one who thought so. The artist Ivashev Musatov passionately argued exactly the same thing. Yes, camp corruption was a mass phenomenon, but not only because camps were awful, but because in addition, we Soviet people stepped upon the soil of the archipelago spiritually disarmed, long since prepared to be corrupted, already tinged by it out in freedom, and we strained our ears to hear from the old camp veterans how to live in camp. But we ought to have known how to live and how to die without any camp. And perhaps Varlam Tikhonovich Shalma, as a general rule, friendship between people does not arise in need and misfortune. It does arise in need and misfortune, even in extreme misfortune too, but not between such withered and nasty people as we were given our decades of upbringing. If corruption was so inevitable, then why did Olga Lvovna Fliosberg not abandon her freezing friend on the forest trail, but stay behind for nearly certain death together with her and save her? Wasn't that an extreme misfortune? And if corruption was so inevitable, then why? Then where did Vasily Meflodievich Yakovenko spring from? He served out 2 terms, had only just been relieved, was living as a free employee in Vorkuta, and was just beginning to crawl around without an escort and acquire his first tiny nest. It was 1949. In Vorkuta, they began to rearrest former sects and give them new sentences, an arrest psychosis. There was panic among the free employees. How could they hold on to their freedom? How could they be less noticeable? But Witty Grodzinski, a friend of Yakovenko from the same Vorkuta camp, was arrested. During the interrogation, he was losing strength and was close to death. There was no one to bring him food parcels, and Yakovenko fearlessly brought him food parcels. If you want to, you dogs, rake me in too. Why was this man not corrupted? And do not all those who survived remember one or another person who reached out a hand to him in camp and saved him at a difficult moment? Yes, the camps were calculated and intended to be too corrupt, but this didn't mean that they succeeded in crushing everyone. Just as in nature, the process of oxidation never occurs without an accompanying reduction. One substance oxidizes, while at the same time another reduces. So in Camp 2, and everywhere in life, there is no corruption without assent. They exist alongside one another. In the next part, I hope still to show how in other camps, in the special camps, a different environment was created. After a certain time, the process of corruption was greatly hampered, and the process of assent became attractive even to the camp careerists. I think I have to stop there. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.